since completing her dietetics degree, Laura has worked in a variety of positions within the health service in the UK and abroad, and established her own consultancy, Laura Clark Nutrition, in 2005. Laura Clark is the founder of the Menopause Dietitian and the Pause to Nourish community, bringing together evidence-based nutritional science together with training in intuitive eating, behaviour change, and acceptance and commitment therapy, which allows Laura to provide insightful expertise dished up with a spoonful of realism and compassion. She's passionate about cutting through the often controversial and confusing world of nutrition, focusing on the interplay between our food choices, our minds, and our environment to give women the confidence and clarity they need to do the right thing by their health and body through midlife, the menopause, and beyond. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks to Ro as well. I feel like you all just probably need to stand up and have a shake or something, because I'm conscious that I'm following a really awesome presentation with loads of info in it, and it's hot and it's lunchtime. So if you need to, stand up and have a wiggle and do whatever you need to do to get the most out of this little chunk of time with me, then obviously I'm really sorry I'm not in the room. I would absolutely love to be there. I live in Bath. That's a really long way away from where you guys are right now. So here I am with the cat, and I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. But yeah, thank you for the little intro. I suppose that the menopause as a speciality for me has really evolved out of heading into those perimenopausal years myself. I think when I launched the Menopause Dietitian, my husband sort of slightly panicked that it was my way of announcing to him that I was menopausal, which is not actually the case. But it is, I suppose, something that my peer group talks about a lot. As Ro was saying, fertility has a really personal message for her. And for me, the menopause is just that as well. I've worked with women in the NHS and in my own consultancy now for many, many years, and specialised in weight management for most of those. And so that brings me really with my own take on what I see working in the weight management field for women, particularly when they get into midlife. And I'll touch on that a little bit. But my area of specialty now takes me into much more of the psychological components of why we do what we do. And I tend to work with women to support them to break free from diet culture and really to form healthy food relationships that support valued living. And the reason that that taps into the menopause so much is that it is just so profound for so many women, and it really starts to create challenge where perhaps they were able to dig deep, carry on, put the plaster over it, whatever, and actually menopause really forces a lot of women to reevaluate their nutrition, their bodies, their mindset, and how they want to navigate those years. I do a little bit of media work as well, but I don't get to hang out with sexy doctors as much as I would like. As I say, most of my clients now do tend to be middle-aged women. So in this session, we're going to have a whip through the hormonal shifts that we associate with this perimenopausal phase. I want to give you a sense of really how diet relates to changes in our physiology and body composition associated with the menopause, and then really give you a sense of what to look out for when you're working with women in this age group. So, as we know, the menopause has really hit the spotlight in recent years, thanks to people like Davina, and really about time, I think. The British Menopause Society has got some really brilliant free resources and infographics if you want to take a look at those. But the resounding message is that more than half of women who go through the menopause say that it has a negative impact on their lives. So this is something that perhaps our mothers didn't really talk about, but we are certainly starting to find our voice and to recognise that actually the perimenopausal journey for a lot of women can last a number of years and be quite debilitating. So let's just be clear on a few definitions then, because obviously menopause itself is a retrospective diagnosis. So if we have not had a period for a year, we are said to have gone through the menopause, the menstrual cycle has ceased completely, and the hormonal levels of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone have stabilized at lower levels. But the perimenopausal phase is where we really want to draw our attention. It's this transition phase. It's characterized by these huge hormonal fluctuations. We generally see that the early warning signs are that our periods will start to become irregular. They may change in flow or frequency. But there are a host of other symptoms, which I'll just touch on in a moment. The average length of this phase is about 4 years, but it does vary greatly. And often for a lot of women, they feel like they're on this kind of hormonal roller coaster. We also have surgical menopause, which is brought about by the removal or loss of ovaries. And if someone is entering into the menopause under the age of 40, then they are said to have primary ovarian insufficiency. And there are a number of reasons why this might occur. So genetics, autoimmune conditions, or perhaps some chemo or radiotherapy. So these are the terms. The average age of menopause in the UK is 51. And we certainly know that lower estrogen levels will increase our health risks for things like cardiovascular disease and osteoporosis. So already we can get a sense, can't we, of why diet might be playing an important part in this puzzle. The functions of estrogen are far-reaching, and I think we grow up with an understanding that estrogen is a reproductive hormone, and clearly it's doing a load of stuff in our uterus and vagina, etc., really helping to protect the integrity of those vaginal tissues. But it also has anti-inflammatory effects in the body, and so that has an impact on our hearts, as well as our bones and our muscles. It also plays a huge number of roles within the brain in terms of mood regulation, temperature regulation, as well as how we use fuel. So, of course, hot flushes is the symptom that we've always known was existing alongside the menopause. Even, before I really knew what the menopause was, I kind of got the sense that hot flushes were a thing. And that's, of course, because estrogen is playing a role in how we are regulating our body temperature. So lots of functions of estrogen. Estrogen receptors are sitting in most tissues in the body. So it's not surprising that we can see that there are so many symptoms that women may suffer from. I think this is a really nice graph that really just hammers home the point of this roller coaster, and that's where diagnosis can be difficult and management can be difficult, because it's not just this steady decline. The blood test results are therefore not particularly accurate, because actually what's up one day is down the next day. So that's the message that we need to understand and to get out there to women that we're working with. So generally, we are going to see that we've got a decline in estrogen and progesterone, and that this is coupled with an elevation in our follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. So obviously, the follicle stimulating hormone is trying to encourage those ovaries to squeeze as much estrogen out as possible. But the FSH can be low or high, and that can vary day to day. So our diagnosis of menopause really should be based on history and on symptoms, because blood tests don't really add anything to the picture if menopausal symptoms are present. So the official guidance is that if somebody is under the age of 40, then doing an FSH level a couple of times at different intervals will give you a sense of whether there's clearly something going on here if the FSH levels are raised. If someone is aged 40 to 45, it's a little bit of a grey area. Ovarian function really does have to be quite diminished before our FSH levels will rise. And it's not particularly useful in women over the age of 45, because really at that point you can assume that perimenopause is quite likely, and therefore you should be looking at the symptoms that they are presenting with. But what's interesting in the women that I see is that they are still going to their GPs, they are still getting blood tests, they're getting these FSH levels back, which are low, and the GP is then saying, oh, it's okay, you've got nothing to worry about, even though they are presenting with a number of other symptoms which would be suggestive of perimenopause. So even though we have lots of information out there now about menopause, and seemingly it's a very easy thing to start to have conversations around, there is definitely a discrepancy between the stuff that we can easily find out and what some healthcare professionals are still giving as messaging to these women. So I want, obviously, with you guys, you're not necessarily working with menopausal women all of the time. I see this study day as really enhancing your knowledge in lots of different areas of women's health. So I think I want to really just put on your radar that if you're working with any woman around the age of 40 to 55, they are at some point within that bracket going to go through the menopause. And so if they are presenting to you with other things such as fatigue or weight management or gut health issues or thyroid issues, just bear in mind that the perimenopause might be playing a part here, and that they themselves might not even yet realize that. So I think that's an important role that we can play in helping these women join the dots. So as I say, the symptoms are, far reaching, but of course, some of them are so subtle and can be attributed to so many other things, particularly thyroid function. There's lots of crossover with the sorts of symptoms that you might initially see in perimenopause. And so it can get missed. And because midlife women generally have massive to-do lists and are pushed for time, and stress levels in midlife are high, often they will go for a number of years just feeling a bit crap and not really understanding that this is because they're in perimenopause. And obviously the role for diet that we can see here can play its part in helping with energy management, with weight management, with excessive bleeding, which would of course impact nutritional requirements for things like iron. Diet has a role to play in sleep, in very key menopausal symptoms such as those flushes. We also know diet, of course, plays such a big part in our mental health and mood regulation, as well as our digestive health and all of this disease prevention around cardiovascular disease and bone health. So there's lots that we can do with diet, which I think as dietitians is really empowering. So just to touch on HRT itself then, so hormone replacement therapy, this will come in two forms. So it will either be estrogen alone, which is always the core ingredient of all forms of HRT, or it will be estrogen and progesterone combined. You would only give estrogen alone if a woman had had a total hysterectomy. If they do have a womb intact, then you do need to give progesterone because you need to protect the lining of the womb. If we don't give progesterone, we will get thickening of that womb lining, that endometrium, and increase our risk of cancer in the long term. So it's more common that women will have what we call combined HRT. It's known as body identical HRT. This is the most common form, and it's licensed for symptom control. So we don't tend to prescribe HRT simply to give protective benefits to health, although those are really clear. It is currently licensed for symptom control. Best used under the age of 60 and best used within 10 years of a woman developing symptoms of perimenopause. So the first line would be some sort of micronized progesterone, so for example, Utrogestan, or they might already have a Mirena coil in situ. You would do this then alongside some sort of topical estrogen, which could be in the form of a gel, a patch, or a spray. As we've said, we know it protects our bones and cardiovascular health. We absorb our patches and gels through the skin, so there's no metabolizing through the GI tract. And estrogen generally is not absorbed particularly well if we take it orally. There is no evidence that HRT causes weight gain, and in fact, it may help to prevent the extent of weight gain. And most women would be on it for around 5 years, but of course, there's lots of individual variation. So there was a huge amount of treatment controversy around HRT that you might be aware of that came from the Women's Health Initiative study in the early 2000s. And almost overnight, the headline came out that HRT unequivocally increased the risk of breast and ovarian cancers, and this led to a decline in HRT use of 79%, pretty much overnight. What's really, really sad about this, though, is that the Women's Health Initiative was found to be inadequately designed, evaluated, and reported. I won't go into all the detail around that now, we haven't got time. But I wanted to make the point that really in this cohort of women, the average age was 63. Some of those women already had cardiovascular disease developing. And they also at that time were looking at oral synthetic estrogens, which is now no longer really best practice. So completely different circumstances, and we are absolutely clear from the evidence that HRT will provide the most benefit when it's given earlier on, so not in women who are already 10 years after they've been through the menopause. But it is something that really, shook a generation of women. And sadly, in the time that they came off that HRT, we did actually see breast and ovarian cancers returning and increasing. It was all really badly reported. So we might find that women are still very cautious about taking HRT. And of course, there are some contraindications for it. So if women have an estrogen dependent cancer, or a thromboembolism, or any undiagnosed vaginal bleeding, there are things that, of course, do need to be investigated. But some women also may just feel that they don't want to go down the HRT route. They don't want to replace those hormones, and then they would be looking to diet perhaps to do more. Interestingly, we've got data that shows that diet can have an impact on the time that we go into menopause. We are going to see lots of these similar foods coming up again, which is, I think, quite reassuring that it's not completely new dietary advice. But high intakes of oily fish and fresh legumes do seem to delay the onset of natural menopause, and refined grains were associated with an earlier menopause. And the reason this is so significant, of course, is that age at which we go through menopause is increasingly recognised as an indicator for health outcome later in life. So the work that Roe is advocating for, whether that's got a fertility angle, we still want that sort of diet to be continued after that woman conceives and heads on into her 20s, 30s and beyond. The thing, of course, that we most know is associated with menopause is weight gain. We know that there is this increase in abdominal obesity and associations with increased triglycerides, total cholesterol, LDL, fasting glucose. There's an association with insulin resistance. It doesn't paint a particularly good picture. And this is because with the lowering of female reproductive hormones, we take on more of that male distribution of fat. But it is not exclusively down to these hormonal shifts. I think that's really key. Alongside the shift in where we store fat, we also can see that there are lower lean masses, soft tissue, and total body water contents. So there are so many components to this. And the research actually shows us that weight gain generally is far more linked to age and physical activity levels than it is to hormones specifically. So the context and the confounding factors here are really key, because a woman presenting with weight gain in their mid-40s is going to have a completely unique lived experience that may well have involved numerous dieting attempts already. There will be genetic components, there will be impacts of previous dieting on their body composition, there will be lifestyle factors, there will be stress, there'll be all of those things. I don't need to kind of teach you to make that obvious. We can see, can't we, that if we've got somebody that has gained weight in midlife, that it's quite clearly partly down to their hormonal shifts, but there are going to be other factors as well. But what we can quite clearly see is that estrogen, as I said, is actually really anti-inflammatory. And so when we get these declining estrogen levels, we fundamentally get this this drive of this systemic inflammatory state. And these changes in these inflammatory markers are significantly correlated with these changes that we see in abdominal fat. But the problem that we have is that women are gaining weight associated with the menopause, and they are reaching to diet culture for the answers. So they're cutting carbs, they're going high protein, they're going back to Slimming World, they're buying all the Michael Mosley books, they're doing all of this stuff. And there is a lack of appreciation of the number of other factors which are playing a part here. And inflammation is definitely one of them. So the role that I play with women is to really try to help them pull back and look at that bigger picture so that they can really get a sense of the power that diet can have in protecting them and supporting the extent to which that weight gain occurs, as opposed to suddenly then going into battle with their food in an attempt to lose weight at all costs. So there's lots of things going on which, as I said, are not immediately obvious. I don't really understand this slide, so I'm not going to talk about it in great detail. But what I think it illustrates really beautifully is this connection that we have with these reproductive organs, this lowering of estrogen and progesterone, and the connection that that then has to increasing of these pro-inflammatory markers, which we know are capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier. And that's where we start to see the impact within our brain. And that is what is causing this increase in neurodegenerative disease associated with post-menopausal women. So it's cardiovascular health, but of course we need to understand that that's our brain health as well. There is no doubt that a woman's risk of stroke and cardiac arrest increases exponentially after the onset of menopause. And so we have to really fly the flag for how nutrition will play a part in that. We've got some interesting data coming out from the Zoe Predict studies. We can certainly see that postmenopausal women seem to have higher sugar intakes, poorer sleep than premenopausal women. And they also are not processing their food in the same way. So there seems to be higher levels of glucose, insulin, and inflammatory markers present after a meal. But of course, with this scenario, we have to ask ourselves, well, why are these postmenopausal women having higher sugar intakes? They're not doing that because they lack information about the benefits of a Mediterranean diet. They're doing that because they have these huge fluctuations. Their sleep is disrupted. We know that they have these bigger rises and falls in their glucose levels, so their cravings for sugar will be far more pronounced. They might well have developed coping strategies that involve sugary food. We have to look at that kind of bigger picture of what's going on for that woman. So particular nutrient considerations for perimenopause. Protein is an interesting one because I say the general messaging that these women are picking up is that they need to go high protein, they need to protect their lean muscle mass, and carbohydrates are the devil. That's essentially the messaging that they are getting. Certainly, higher protein intakes seem to support this change in metabolic flexibility. So clearly, if women are not eating very much protein and they're eating, platefuls of carbohydrates late into the evening, we can see that picture not panning out particularly well for their menopausal symptoms or their body composition. But we don't have any specific requirements for protein. And I think what's so key when you're assessing these women is that you actually get a sense of what their current protein intake is. Because in my experience, actually, a lot of women do consume adequate protein, but their perception is that it's not enough. The carbohydrate gets displaced out of their diet entirely. Bucket loads of protein goes in. Of course, their digestive health, which is already on a bit of a sticky wicket, worsens, and they're in a whole lot of bother. Vitamin D, basic recommendations, of course, are that we take that 10 micrograms over autumn and winter. But I think there is a little bit of a case in postmenopausal women, definitely, who are at risk of osteoporosis, that perhaps the vitamin D needs to be slightly higher, but we'll come to that. Omega-3, again, we know, of course, it has these anti-inflammatory properties, but we don't have particular guidance on omega-3. And of course, there is some controversy around supplementing omega-3 and whether really that is as powerful as getting the omega-3 from foods itself. So you would have to assess that person individually. Magnesium is another nutrient that crops up a lot. Lots of menopausal supplements and creams and balms and things like that will contain magnesium. The observational data tells us that blood levels of magnesium seem to be associated with better sleep, but they can't actually then support that with an RCT yet. So bit of a wait and see on that one. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time delving into the intricacies of the Mediterranean diet because Ro's done a fantastic job of that. But one thing I want to highlight, of course, is soya, which plays a huge part in the management of hot flushes. The most recent data is quite powerful that really during 12 weeks, 60% of women were totally free of moderate to severe hot flushes, and overall, all hot flushes, including mild ones, decreased by 79%. So this was done with a combination of a plant-based diet, and they had half a cup of soybeans or edamame beans added into their diet daily. So that's obviously quite a commitment to go for a completely plant-based diet, but there is still mileage in introducing soya foods into the diet, even if somebody wants to take more of a flexitarian approach. Microbiome, not surprisingly, seems to play a part in whether we get this benefit, and that's all to do with whether we are able to metabolize these isoflavones that are the magic ingredient, of course, within these soya foods. These are broken down into a quol, and this is the compound that is responsible for these effects. We can see those that have vegetarian and vegan diets do tend to produce higher levels of equol. So this is one of these scenarios where you can make a recommendation, and for some women it will hit the spot, and for other women perhaps not. So certainly in disease protection, we're coming back to the Mediterranean diet again. I think we're clear team here, aren't we, on what the Mediterranean diet consists of. And there's been numerous theories put forward as to really how this seems to help within the menopausal woman. So Ro has touched on oxidative stress and obviously the anti-inflammatory effects of the Mediterranean diet, so that's all quite obvious. And for women, menopausal women, there seems to be perhaps this additional benefit of the richness of magnesium that comes from the Mediterranean diet. So obviously in things like the whole grain cereals, the dark green leafy vegetables, the nuts, the seeds. So again, does this magnesium really play a role in helping with muscle performance and also contraction and relaxation, which of course links to sleep so strongly. And beta carotene, one of the antioxidants that's been singled out to really be supporting an increase in bone formation. Menopause, there's some interesting data coming out around bacterial diversity. We do seem to see that if we have got these dips in estrogen, that we then do have an association with a decreased diversity of bacteria, that there's this reduced barrier integrity, and that potentially if we've got microbes, heading off in different directions, that this is partly contributing to inflammation. But this is all observational data at the moment. We don't have any causation data. Generally, anecdotally, women are reporting that their IBS symptoms are either beginning as a result of menopause or that they're worsening. So we do need to watch this space on that one. It's a bit of a two-way street though. So we do know that the microbiome is also playing a part in estrogen metabolism. And again, this seems to be affected by the menopausal transition. So the microbiome clearly has a role to play in levels of estrogen in the body. And therefore, us doing our bit diet-wise to protect the microbiome and to keep it rich and diverse is going to be key. So bone health then, just to remind you that we know that estrogen is obviously impaired, and so the turnover cycle within our bones is therefore going to change. The amount of bone that we reabsorb is then exceeding the amount that we're laying down, and so we've got this net bone loss. We've got about a 1% loss of bone mineral density each year after the age of 40, which is quite a sobering fact when you've gone over 40. I don't know what the average age of the women I'm talking to is today. Obviously, Ro is still very much hanging on to her 30s, but if any of you are with me in your 40s, then we've got to pay attention to this kind of stat. And the menopausal transition generally is an average loss of around 10%. And of course, then once we're heading into our 60s and 70s, we can see that decrease by about 30 to 40%. So this is a really important consideration. Clearly, again, there's going to be variation based on genetics and those confounding factors. This again is a bit of a shout out for soy. So 2 cups of soy milk a day have been found to increase bone mineral density over 2 years, and also soy is having a protective effect by acting as a weak blocker. So interestingly, we know that soya isoflavones will bind to these estrogen receptors. They will have therefore estrogen-like effects, but they seem to be able to do that in quite a clever way. So they're also blocking as well as enhancing, if that makes sense. So there are other recommendations coming from Europe which don't obviously align with our NHS recommendations. But when we really look at that bigger picture of the lowering of these sex hormones and how that then impacts both our muscles and our bones, we've got sarcopenia to consider as well as osteoporosis. And so, of course, we've got to look at protein, but as I've said, these guidance around sort of 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day is useful and helpful, and you might want to start to educate women around spacing their protein out across the day, certainly thinking about how they eat protein in relation to their exercise regime. I think you've already had a talk on that already. But yeah, not at the expense of carbohydrates, quite clearly. And vitamin D, again, the recommendation is that we're taking those 10 micrograms in autumn and winter. But I think, again, for menopausal women, particularly if there's a family history of osteoporosis, or again, if they've done lots of weird diets where they're likely to have had an impact on their bone mineral density, then taking more vitamin D and taking it throughout the year might be called for. And again, calcium, our NHS guidance is still very much hanging on to the 700 milligrams, but perhaps for preventing osteoporosis, we need to be going higher. The official stance, of course, is that if you have the beginnings of osteoporosis, then you absolutely do need to be taking around 1,000 milligrams a day. But there's a bit of a grey area, I think, again, for some women. So assessing their calcium content of their diet would be really key. There's a really nice calculator on the Osteoporosis Society website that can help you to top that up. And perhaps they need to be thinking about supplementing that. And of course, if they're going plant-based, we want to make sure that they're fortifying their plant-based alternatives with calcium, that they're not choosing organic varieties that won't be fortified. So yeah, just need to bear that in mind. And of course, HRT, as we know, will actually have a protective effect on our bones. I wanted to touch on botanical supplements because you can walk into Holland and Barrett and essentially get them all, right in your face. The ones that are the strongest are things like sage leaf, red clover, and black cohosh. But generally, the claims are fairly vague, the evidence is a bit patchy, and of course, they're not regulated. So we have to be a little bit careful. Most of the botanical supplements seem to be having an effect on these hot flushes. So you could argue that, diet has the potential to do the same. But certainly something for some women to consider if they want to. There's been a lot of noise around time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, whatever you want to call it. I don't think we've got a lot of data that's specifically homing in on the menopausal population and looking at this. But we can see that they've started to sort of reanalyze some of the data that they've previously got and compare pre and post menopausal women. So in this particular 8-week trial, there were improvements in body weight and fasting insulin. Insulin resistance was better, but there wasn't a significant difference between pre and post menopausal women. So logically, we know that we are not as sensitive to glucose later on in the day. We can see from that Zoe data that these women have got higher levels of glucose after a meal, and that inflammation is staying higher, etc., etc. So it could be logical to think that actually employing some kind of a fast for a slightly longer period of time might be beneficial. But I think we really need to be cautious. And what I see in my clinical practice is that women get hold of this idea of time restricted feeding. They start doing the sort of the classic 16-8, so they're not eating anything all morning. They're being encouraged to sort of ignore their hunger cues. And yes, they might want to stop eating earlier on in the evening, but actually, unless they're going to address the reasons why they habitually sit on the sofa at 9:30 at night and have a packet of biscuits, then putting out this message that intermittent fasting is something they should definitely do is going to be really challenging, and all it's going to do is create a more eroded relationship with themselves and their body. So we have to tread really carefully. So this message around dieting, of course, is really strong in these menopausal years. We know, as I've said, that this weight gain will occur, but there's a number of reasons why that is happening. And for some of my women, it really is not appropriate for them to go on yet another diet if they have spent the last 20, 30 years of their life already dieting. And this really is the time to start to make peace with food so that they can really use it to their advantage. They can really nourish their bodies. They can support their bone health. They can support their cardiovascular health. They can eat a beautiful Mediterranean diet and not have that Mediterranean diet abused by certain health journalists who will really push for that to be low carbohydrate. And there is no Mediterranean diet really, by definition, that is low in carbohydrate. So I think we need to be really careful with that kind of messaging that's becoming so mainstream. And so don't forget that in a woman who is dieting, you're going to get a number of things happening. So we know dieting will cause ghrelin to go up, leptin to go down. So they're chasing hunger, they're not feeling fullness. It will also raise their cortisol levels. But in a woman who is in that perimenopausal roller coaster, they are already going to be more likely to feel the effects of the stress response. We know menopausal transition is associated with higher levels of anxiety and depression. We have to tread really carefully in how we then talk about food, because somebody's response to food when perimenopausal is completely different to how it is when they're in their 20s, for example. The intuitive eating world is one that you might well have delved into. It's certainly really foundational now to how I practice. But this is really, a way in which I start that conversation with women to say that fundamentally, if you're looking for weight loss, it is not a behavior. And we can categorically see that if you have certain habits in place, and no surprises for guessing that those habits are not smoking, drinking alcohol in moderation, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, and doing physical activity, that irrespective of what your BMI is, if those habits are in place, your risk of death is exactly the same, whether you have a BMI of over 30 or whether you have a BMI of 22, for example. So really, really key that we have more sophisticated conversations with women around this stuff. So I would argue in this life stage, yes, they're keen for information. Yes, there's lots that diet can do, but it's really not so much the what. They come to me with the, I need a meal plan. Can you just give me a diet plan? I'm gaining weight. I don't like it. Please help me fix it. That's what they come to me with. But really the angle I then encourage them to take is to really consider their lived experience and what's right for them at this point. their lived experience. They have built up various beliefs along the way about, their bodies, what's right for their health, their mindset, and that plays a huge part in the symptoms and how those symptoms present, the coping strategies that they have developed, their relationship with food, and therefore their receptiveness to dietary advice. And the data around CBT and managing menopausal symptoms is actually quite strong. So we know that there's a huge link there between our mindsets and our bodies. And a lot of the women I see have got a complete disconnect actually between mind and body. And that's where you have to start. So to finish off, if you're all still with me, I've got no idea, you might have all disappeared out the room for lunch, but anyway, we can see that diet does have a lot of potential, obviously, to support symptom reduction. The plant-based focus, the Mediterranean focus, is really powerful for improving disease risk and really helping women through this transition. Clearly, it's a really good complement to medical therapy. So some women may want to use diet instead of HRT. In my experience, it really is such a foundational component of HRT being effective. You cannot stick an estrogen patch on you if you have really rocky foundations with how you self-care and how you nourish yourself. And so always take into consideration that at this point in our lives, we are going to have a lived experience, and that will play a huge part in how you start to have conversations around nutrition, with individualized advice, of course, always being key. I think that's it. I will stop sharing. You can find me at themenopause.dietitian.co.uk, and I'm on social media at menopause.dietitian. The way that I tend to support women the most, I would say, is either through working with them one-to-one, or they will come into my community and do my Pause to Nourish course, which is self-paced, and the Nourish Lounge, which is Zoom chats every couple of weeks, is completely free for my email community, and again gives them an opportunity to come in, have lunch and listen to chats. I talk to psychologists and personal stylists and various people, and conversations that really matter to midlife women, because you have to look at the whole picture, I think, when you get to this stage. Anyway, I'll stop sharing, and obviously happy to answer. Oh my goodness, there's my massive face again. Always happy to then answer any questions if you guys have any.